talk about Zambia because of, we're really a case study, so to speak. So I think most of the details have been sort of shared. Is it Jamal, the first speaker?
Yes. Jamal.
Jamal. I think Jamal touched on quite a number of issues. He brought in the whole perspective of debt in Africa, and also what sort of impact it has on food security, agriculture as well. Sorry, I like to move sometimes. So, So, if you look at the World Bank, you find that between 2008 and 2018, that decade, that 10 years, debt jumped in sub-Saharan Africa, jumped nearly 150%. I don't know what sort of trend came up so that we could begin to, borrow so much. But debt has been such an elephant in the room. For example, if you look at the average public debt in sub-Saharan Africa increased from 40% of GDP in 2010 to about 59% in 2018. So you could see that debt is obviously a very huge issue. And again, I'm tempted to speak about Zambia. We've seen just how much debt has sort of increased over the years. We're talking about debt moving to close to 30 billion, public external debt about 12.7 billion. So you could see how much this is. Look at debt to GDP ratio shooting above 120%. So you could see that Zambia and other African countries are really facing this debt situation. But the thing about debt is really how it impacts the people and how it impacts the lowest income people. If you look at some of the governments in Africa, their budgets have been dedicated to supporting debt service repayments. And this has a huge impact. I think Jamal did talk about how this sort of diminishes government's capacity to support social sector spending and also more specifically into agriculture. If we're going to talk about food security, obviously, what we need to see obviously is an increase in agricultural allocations and of course social sector spending. But then how are we going to do that when we have a huge sort of debt? Our debt interest payments are rising by the minute. So there's this phenomenon that's happening in Southern Africa, in the global South, where governments have to face this dilemma to, service debt or choose to invest in social sector spending, protect citizens from poverty, and more specifically, ensure that we have sustainable sort of food security. So really, it's how the conversation really is how debt is really impacting or limiting government to sort of spend or support the poorest in our communities. So also the other aspect we can talk about is how we keep on we keep on relying on imports. I think he's already talked about how we are highly import dependent in Zambia, and this is a huge situation in other countries in Africa. So you can only see how these interlinkages. You depend on Ukraine, you depend on Russia, and then there's all these global phenomena that are happening like war, and we see that these supply linkages are sort of disrupted, and again that sort of threatens food security in countries that are highly dependent on those countries that are undergoing those turmoils. So it's also how we begin to become more sustainable in sort of investing in R&D. How do we begin to build our own industries? How do we begin to build our own local seed sector to ensure that we're not just empowering these multinational corporations that sort of come into our countries and get all the profits to, at the expense of our local SMEs, our local producers. So it's very important that we begin to see that. I think most of the speakers have handled a lot of things, but I'm just going to also begin to speak to some of the solutions that Africa should be focusing on going forward. I think as we sort of try and see how we negotiate or sort of speak to our creditors, we need to be able to ensure that we also bring about, the aspect of debt for nature swap. That could be an option that we can also begin to use as we renegotiate with our creditors. It's very important that we understand that in this dispensation rather, the one phenomenon is climate change. you can see that the impacts are very, very clear here in Africa. The women, the youths, and the differently abled stand to be impacted more by some of these things. So how then can we begin to negotiate with our creditors to begin to be rewarded by promoting nature conservation, wildlife conservation as well, and all that. The other aspect I also want to bring about is Africa should learn to target incentives better. Of course, there is this plight for FDI. Everybody wants to get an investor. But investors are going to invest anyway because obviously there's limited empirical evidence to show that tax incentives are going to enable are going to influence entirely influence an investor's destination choice. So we need to ensure that these incentives are targeting also the local small medium enterprises, the small farmers. You see, there's a lot of the majority of people in Africa are involved in agriculture. So how do we begin then to support these people? How do we begin to bring about incentives that are going to be well targeted at these small SMEs, as opposed to just giving incentives and tax holidays to these corporations that might not exactly mean well for our countries. It's important. I think one aspect that one of the speakers mentioned was unity, how we need to put up a collaborative front in tackling or in speaking to our creditors. It's important that as Africa is negotiating with the creditors, we were able to come up with a united front to begin to lobby G20 finance ministers to ensure that we increase our SDR allocations so that we are able to have our promote food security, and also just see how we can support social sector spending. The other aspect, of course, is how we need to ensure that the Africa Free Continental Trade Area is not just a matter of formality. It is a great vehicle that we can use as Africans to push the agenda of putting debt in the past, because we cannot keep the next 20 years talking about debt. How are we going to be able to sort out this debt situation? So we need to see a clear sort of direction through the AFCFTA with how we're going to sort of tackle the debt situation, how we're also going to promote trade and investment amongst each other, so that we are able to boost our domestic resource mobilization, boost our industries and all that. The last aspect I want to also speak about is climate financing. It's very important that we begin to see, I've already talked about how climate change is impacting the poorest people in our communities. It's very important that we begin to see that, even as we want to contract debt, like Boyd did mention, debt is not a bad thing. It's entirely how we use it, or perhaps who we borrow from. That really matters. So it's how we use the debt. Sometimes it's very important that we begin to see that we're not just borrowing for infrastructural development, but how do we also borrow to finance, adaptation activities, so we are able to build resilient communities. We're able to build a green economy that is in the end going to be able to reward our GDP. I will be failing, of course, if I don't speak about this, but I know it's already been spoken about, but I jotted this down. I think going forward, also, African countries must be able to present legislation that is very key in promoting transparency and accountability. Boyd has mentioned the Access to Information Act, or Access to Information legislation. This must be seen across Africa. This way, we're going to be able to empower the citizens to demand for accountability from our leaders. It's not just a matter of them promising to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but then how do we ensure that people have that they're empowered to demand for that information, that they're empowered to demand to know what the terms of a certain double treaty agreement says, what the terms of perhaps if it's a debt that a country gets. The citizens should be empowered, so they should know that. Also, we need to see that we have stricter debt legislation, so that we limit reckless borrowing. Borrowing should be done in a very in a very meaningful manner. We do not want to see this situation that we've seen the last decade continue to be the subject of our discussions in the next 20 years. So I think for now, I think I'll just I'll let the next speaker also have their time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we really appreciate, for keeping time as you are doing your presentation. So without wasting much of our time, I think I'll